My name is Kevin Jones. I've been working for NGINX for 4 years. I'm a solutions architect and a global consulting engineer, so handle all of the customers that we use primarily here. The demo I'm going to be giving today is of NGINX Controller, but more specifically, I'm going to be talking about the API management module. The API management module, again, it's a rather new tab that we've added to the actual product. But the idea here is that we want to be able to publish APIs through a virtual server configuration, make actual application servers available to load balance as well, and then also define policies for access to those APIs. So when you first log in, you can see up here on the left, as you know, we have a list of the servers that are checked in. So the servers that I'm going to be configuring today are 2 Ubuntu servers. They're running NGINX Plus. They're running on EC2, but we do support other cloud providers and multi-cloud as well. But particularly, I'm only going to be configuring 2 NGINX instances as an API gateway. I'm going to come in here to the API management module, and you can see that there's 4 tabs on the left. Okay, we're going to start by creating what we call an entry point. So an entry point essentially is a virtual server. So it is a actual domain that you're trying to publish for an actual application. Okay, so the API that I'm going to be doing is an actual sports-related API. Okay, so we can name it here, and we can also define the host name that we want to use, right? And then we can decide what port that we want to actually publish it on, right? So we're going to start with 80. Actually, we're going to use 80, but I'm going to show you how 443 would look after in a second here. And then you decide which NGINX instances that you want to configure as an API gateway. So in my case, again, I have 2, so I can select both of those because I'm going to be doing either some kind of load balancer in front of there to do load balancing traffic, or I might use like DNS to do round robin traffic between those 2. So I'm configuring 2 instances, and I just have to hit create. So now I have a virtual server configured with a domain of sports.example.com on port 80. And we can do support other port tiers. So if you want to do 8,000 for some reason or multiple ports, you can. I'm just going to keep it simple and do port 80. So if I come back to entry points, now we can see that I have the API there, but I don't have any kind of environment assigned, right? So this is just kind of like a blanket virtual server. It hasn't been published yet, okay? So now I want to create an actual backend. So if you're familiar with NGINX, we use what's called upstream. So upstream is just a group of servers, okay? In this case, I have 2 backend servers, and I've created DNS records for them. And I'm going to call this backend. So I'm going to make multiple groups. First one is going to be a data endpoint, okay? And once I click save, it's going to allow me to add my backends into that pool or that backend. And so I'm going to do 8001 and 8002. Why is that not resolving? Did I copy it wrong? Probably. There we go. So I've added 1. Now I can go ahead and toss 1 more on there. So I just have on the back end, I'm actually running a Formula 1 API as an application server. And so that's what we're going to use to set up today. And I have that running in Docker on the host, just add a local host on port 8000 and 8000, or 8001 and 8002. So that's why I'm defining 2 backends. Okay. So these are actually 2 containers running locally on that NGINX gateway. Of course, if you had those servers on another server or another Docker container, that's fine. You would just define here the host name or the IP, and then the port of where you want to route that traffic. Okay. So now I hit save. Now I can see I have 1, right, named backup data. I'm going to create 1 more that I'm going to call backend admin, which is more of an admin endpoint. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to use the same port, okay? And I'm going to use the same host name, okay? But I'm going to show you later how, even though I'm using the same port, I can actually define policies for the API by the URL, okay? So if I click save, now I look at upstream groups. You can see that I have 2. I have an admin and I have a data one, right? So the data is going to be more of a client-side publicly exposed API endpoint. The backend admin is going to be more of a API that's maybe controlled by an administrator or some kind of application development team, okay? So now that I have my virtual server and I have my backends, I'm going to start creating a policy for these. An actual API definition is what we call it, and policies for that actual definition, okay? So in our case, as I mentioned before, it is a Formula 1 API that I'm going to publish, okay? And to be simple, so I don't have to keep typing this over again, I can just put in here the full path up to the context that I want to allow. So in this case, it's /API/F1 that's available in this API. And then I'm going to hit save. Okay. Now, I haven't published anything yet. So if I come over to my console here and I actually try to do a curl command on this actual domain, we can see that we're able to resolve the IP, but it's not resolving, right? There's an empty reply from the server, okay? We're going to come back to that in a second. So now that I have the Formula One API configured, or as far as the actual name and the path, I need to tell it exactly what URLs that I want to publish, okay? So I'm going to come in here to what we call resources. So the resources essentially is the URI of the API, and it's going to append to whatever the base path is. So in this case, I have /drivers, which is a listing of all of the Formula One drivers. I have another one called /circuits, which is a listing of all of the actual tracks, right? And then I have /constructors, which is a listing of all of the overpaid automobile companies. If you watch Formula One, you'll know that. And then I have the seasons, okay? Now for the seasons, you'll notice that I'm choosing the prefix path for all of the other ones, which is basically just doing a wildcard regular expression match for those endpoints so that you can go deeper into the API. But specifically for the seasons one, I'm gonna assume that this is a more of a controlled endpoint, and I'm gonna actually tell it that I want an exact match, okay? So it doesn't allow anyone to go in and browse that API any further than the actual base path that I'm going to allow, okay? That's just for a security reason. Maybe you don't want to allow them to go further than whatever you're defining, right? So I'm going to keep that an exact match. Now that we've created pretty much all of the actual URIs and the resources and the virtual server and the backends, now we need to decide, well, what environment am I configuring, okay? So in this case, you can do development, test, stage, prod, QA, whatever environment you want. It's up to you. This doesn't have to be, this is more of a naming convention, and it applies to whatever your company does. So in my case, I'm going to do a development, right, instance. This is where we kind of go full circle, and we actually map that environment into the actual virtual server. And so here all we do is select the sports API that I defined in the first very step, okay? So we're connecting this actual development environment to that original virtual server, and then we're going to click add. So that kind of links those together. And then you'll see here that we have policies, which I'm going to get to in a second, which is where we can do like some of the authentication and the rate limiting and whatnot. And then we can do routes, okay? So routes is the actual resources and where they're getting routed to on the upstreams that I configured in the second tab here, okay? And so this is where you tell, hey, for the actual constructors endpoint, go to the group of servers or the backend that has the data endpoint. And let's do a blanket allow. So let's allow anyone to access that. There's no actual security requirement around that. Now we can do the same thing for the other ones. So circuits is also a data endpoint, right? And then also one more, which is the drivers endpoint, which is also data. But as I mentioned before, we want to take the specifically the seasons endpoint, and we want to make that routed to the actual admin, right? It's a special group of servers that's only doing admin functionality, okay? So for that one, we're going to get into that in a second, but here we're going to do a special policy based on the authentication, and maybe we're doing some special rate limiting or whatnot. But before we do that, I just want to show you that the publish icon is available now. So now at this point, all we have to do is hit publish. So what it's going on right now is NGINX controller is communicating with the agent that is running on each API gateway node over HTTPS with mutual client certificates with an API key. So it's double security, and it's passing all of the information, it's pushing any configs it needs, it's making any changes to whatever API or whatever needs to be done on the NGINX server is all automated. And then it's testing the configuration locally, making sure that it's not going to error out or have any issues, and then it's going to publish. So it should publish any minute now. While it's doing that, question?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's good to see you walk through this functionality in the GUI and see how you would configure this.
Yeah.
But I would imagine in a more agile scenario, you would want to publish these APIs through some sort of code commit and push, as opposed to clicking through the portal, especially if you want to roll it out for dev, staging, QA, et cetera. So is that something that exists today, or is that something that's coming?
Again, I believe that's
That's
something.
also on the roadmap.
Yeah, it's one of those things where we know that.
Yes, I think so. Can you guys hear me?
We know that people want that functionality. So before I worked at NGINX, I worked at yellowpages.com.
Yeah.
So I get it. It's more of a CI/CD type of thing where you really want to be able to publish and push that stuff out. So it's definitely coming.
Right.
Okay.
Is that coming soon? Because it feels like that's kind of fairly limited. I'd want the GUI after being able to actually program an API via, like especially most modern APIs, these kind of paths, there's tens if not hundreds of them. So trying to manage it all clicking through here.
So definitely the dev portal and automating
Controlling.
configuration, that's really top priority. Very high priority for us.
So let me save for questions towards the end. So you saw it pop up if you were watching. There's a green bar that said, hey, it published, right? More specifically, we can see the alerts tab, as Jason mentioned, and we can see that April 10th at 17:43, it was published and it was successful. So we can mark all those as red and we can clear that out. So we know now that we actually have a publicly exposed API. So we can go ahead and hit it. And we can see now that we're able to hit the API. We're not getting an issue, but we're specifically getting a 404 not found. Okay. So I think if you're on the WebEx, you might not be able to, or the Zoom, you might not be able to see that. But the idea is that we are instrumenting the actual errors. So we're actually intercepting the error and not giving what the application is giving. We're issuing our own set of errors. So it's a standard JSON-based error. Okay. And there was a section to do that, and I don't remember exactly where it was, but there's a section in here where you can actually tell it, I think it was here, right here, mask errors from upstream servers. Okay. So that being said, we've gone ahead and published that, but we want to go a step further and let's do the authentication piece. Okay. So we're going to go back into the definition, we're going to go to the policies page, and we're going to add a policy. So there's 4 different policies here, okay, that we can actually configure. One is API key. Now, if you do go into the API key, you'll notice that it asks you how you want to present the API key. So you can do either based HTTP request header or a query string. Let's just say we want to get this from an API key header with all bold like that. Or maybe you just want to do, because you don't like bold, something like that. We can actually create what's called a client group. So we can actually go over here now, and we can create a group called clients. And we can say, create a client, and let's call it sports news or something like that. Save. And now that key is stored in our configuration. You can copy it to the clipboard, as it's not available through the UI, so that you can't see what it is, whatnot. So we've created that client group. Now we can go back into where the actual API key is here when we add the policy now, and we say header API underscore key. We can tell it to use that client group and hit save. So now we have that policy. We can also create another policy, which is more popular and less stateful and more dynamic, is a JSON Web Token. So I've already generated a JSON Web Token key file. If you're familiar with JSON Web Token keys, sorry. So cat, okay, secret. So it's just it's basically a set of keys with the actual key in there, and then referencing the issue date or whatever, or the issue ID. So I'm going to load that in, right? And then it's going to ask me how people want to present that. So the most common way is the bearer token, right? If you're familiar with API keys, yep.
Where is your keys token? Where is your key in your storage? And what is the encryption of your key?
So you can configure it to whatever encryption that you want to that is supported by NGINX. So I believe we support, what is it, AES 256 or whatnot. As far as storing it, it's passed to the actual NGINX server and stored locally on NGINX.
Is that a key vault storage?
It's not in a key vault storage, no. It's stored on actual disk.
In plain text.
It's stored in, I believe it's stored in plain text, but you need root access on that server to access it. So there's SSL keys and certificates are also stored in plain text in NGINX. It's been like that for years. Again, you need root to access it. So unless you have given out your root access on your server, then you don't have to worry about it. So the bearer token, we can say, let's just use bearer token for that purpose. You can do other things like the HTTP request header, or you can do a query string or a cookie if it's like a web app. But we're going to do bearer token just to be simple. And we're also going to remove the API key because we don't want to use the API key because it's kind of old and it's not stateless. And then you can also do other policies such as rate limiting. So you can limit the amount of requests that go to that server based off the client IP address or user agent. You can also do other NGINX variable, which is just any NGINX variable. So let's say you want to do an argument. I don't know. Let's say there's an argument with a particular API key. You want to do it that way. You can customize how you limit the rate of access to those APIs. And then here you can tell it, so let's just do client IP address. And we can say 200 requests per second here. And then we can also tell it what to do when it reaches that threshold. So NGINX keeps track of this in memory. So we can do either have it rejected immediately, or we can do throttling, right? We can throttle and kind of queue those up for it. Or we can allow a burst and then throttle. So there's a lot of flexibility. Let's just say we want to reject because of time that I have. And let's just say the standard 429, which is too many requests, right? So we hit save. So now we have two policies. All we need to do is make sure we define that this constructors, seasons here is using a new policy. So there are some default policies in there that you can use. In this case, I want to do a new policy. And I can basically make this, I don't know, let's just call it standard policy for admin, like this. And I can say deny with a 403 unless the JOT claim with role is equal to, what was it? I'm sorry, it's odd is equal to role. Sorry, role, the admin, what's the other one? I'm trying to remember. Seasons or save. So you can customize the access for those particular endpoints. So if I wanted to, and I wanted to control rate limiting, you could create a special policy here and whatnot, and then all I have to do is publish at that point. So and now it's updating and going to push that out. So now if I actually try to go into API/F1/seasons, so right now I'm able to access it. Once the update's done, it shouldn't allow me to.
Can I ask a question while that's publishing it?
Yeah.
Is the API management and the load balancer configuration at the moment two entirely separate pieces? Because typically, if you're doing API management, then where you're sending it to, you want to load balance, but you'll be doing that as your API management tool and the thing you're load balancing won't be the same product. With you guys, you've kind of got that product together. So where you're configuring the entry points and adding nodes, I'm almost feeling like I want to be configuring a load balancer at the same time.
Yeah, so right now it is separate. You can do load balancing with the API management module, but you can't do API management with the load balancing module, if that makes sense. And that's just because the way we designed the tabs, the API management has the more the resources and policies, and it's just got a different workflow. There may be a situation where we might put those together at some point.
So do you get the same power as the configuration piece you'd have for the load balancer in the API management piece where you're configuring that?
Currently, no.
Okay.
It's
So
separate.
a workflow might be at the moment is you'd use the load balancer configuration to configure the load balancer in front of your app, and then what you've exposed with that load balancer, then you use them in the API management here as two separate stages, but within the same tool.
Absolutely. I think Jason.
Yeah, I was going to say, and you can do them both in that same controller, like you were just saying. You can report on them in a unified way, send the alerts in a unified way. And right now it's split up by instances, which NGINX instance is doing API gateway, which one's doing load balancing. We are looking at, on the roadmap, combining them on a per instance basis as well.
Okay, so let's try to hit it now, and we can see now we're getting a 401 unauthorized, right? But if I want to, I've actually already created a API key in the quotes here. So what I can do now is just go ahead and send that as a bearer, like I mentioned before, and boom, we're able to access it. So I passed the API key, and it was successfully allowed me to access that endpoint. So again, without the key, it's going to give me a 401. With the key, it's let me access. Yeah.
For the API keys and some of the other sensitive stuff, are you looking into integration with something like AWS KMS, Azure Key Vault, HashiCorp Vault, like one of those key management services, so you're not storing that stuff locally and you can dynamically roll it over and all that kind of good stuff?
Yeah, we're looking at Vault integrations for both load balancing secrets, API gateway secrets, any of the use case secrets. Yep.
Okay.